In 64 AD, Emperor Nero quietly ordered the silver in Rome's coins to be cut for the first time in its history from nearly pure metal to a slightly thinner truth. By 300 AD, the denarius that once fueled an empire contained barely 2% silver, and on the 15th of August 1971, President Nixon did something eerily familiar. He severed the dollar's final link to gold. The pattern was ancient, but the consequences were always the same. The fall of Rome was not sudden. It was slow, silent, and financial. Behind the conquests, the marble, and the rhetoric of eternal glory, Rome's real engine was money, and when that engine corroded, the empire began to rot from within. Inflation, corruption, and debt crept through society long before the barbarians crossed the frontiers. Rome didn't lose its strength in battle. It lost its credibility in its coins. To fund endless wars and expanding welfare for a restless population, emperors turned alchemists. They melted integrity into illusion, mixing base metals with silver while promising that the coins still held the same value. It was a deception so subtle that most Romans never noticed until their savings turned worthless, their wages meaningless, and their empire ungovernable. This is not just a story about the past, because every empire that believed it could outsmart the laws of money followed the same arc: confidence, corruption, collapse. The names change, denarius becomes dollar, but the mechanism does not. Rome's downfall was written in the metal content of its coins, just as America's future may be written in the ink of its debt. To understand why, we need to go back in time to when money was still sacred, and the first cracks of deception began to form in the empire that once ruled the world. 2 centuries before the empire collapsed, Rome's money was its greatest strength. The denarius, introduced around 211 BC during the Second Punic War, was a coin of near-pure silver trusted from Britannia to Judea. Every soldier, merchant, and farmer knew its weight, its gleam, its worth. It was more than currency. It was confidence cast in metal. This was the Rome of the Republic, disciplined, ambitious, and bound by an almost religious respect for order, including monetary order. But war is expensive. From the conquest of Carthage to the campaigns in Gaul, each victory demanded pay for soldiers, grain for legions, and tribute for generals. The treasury's silver reserves drained faster than they could be refilled. By the time of Julius Caesar, the cracks had begun to show. Caesar's military brilliance came with a staggering cost. Mountains of debt. Ancient sources estimate he owed today's equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars before seizing power. To pay his creditors and his army, Caesar did what ambitious rulers often do. He turned to the mint. New coins were struck, old debts inflated away, and Rome's financial discipline began to bend under the weight of its own ambitions. Augustus, the first emperor, understood the danger. He tried to restore the purity of Rome's money, creating a golden aureus and setting strict standards for silver content. For a century, that stability held. Under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, Rome reached its golden age and its gold-backed credibility. Trade flourished, roads expanded, and the empire's coins were accepted from Egypt to Spain. But prosperity always tempts power to overreach. By the 3rd century, Rome's borders stretched too far, its armies too large, and its promises too expensive. The silver veins of Spain and the Balkans began to run dry, while the empire's appetite for spending only grew. Military salaries doubled, then tripled. The state started paying in debased coins, hoping no one would notice the fraud. They noticed. Prices rose. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Farmers hoarded grain instead of selling it. Confidence, the invisible glue of every monetary system, began to crumble. And with it, the illusion of eternal Roman stability started to fade. The empire had crossed a line it could never uncross. The money had changed, and so had Rome itself. The turning point was near. By the 3rd century AD, Rome's economy had become a mirror of its politics, unstable, chaotic, and desperate. The empire was now ruled by generals who rose and fell at the pace of coups, each one more dependent on the army's loyalty than the law's authority. To keep that loyalty, they paid in coins that glittered less and promised more. Between 200 and 275 AD, the silver content of the denarius collapsed from around 50% to barely 2%. What had once been money became an illusion, a copper disc coated with a trace of silver wash. When Emperor Caracalla introduced the Antoninianus around 215 AD, it was nominally worth 2 denarii, but contained only 1.5 times the silver. It was the first Roman version of quantitative easing minting trust out of thin air. Inflation exploded. Diocletian, ruling in the late 3rd century, tried to impose control by force. In 301 AD, he he issued the edict on maximum prices, setting legal limits on the cost of thousands of goods. It failed spectacularly. Merchants vanished from markets rather than sell at fixed prices. Soldiers demanded payment in kind. The Roman monetary system, once the envy of the ancient world, disintegrated into barter. Ordinary citizens bore the burden. Salaries lagged behind, rising prices, savings evaporated, tax collectors accepted food instead of coins. The rich escaped through land and influence, the poor drowned in devalued money. Economically, the empire split into two worlds, those who could still convert their wealth into something real, and those trapped inside a currency that no longer meant anything. The official narrative blamed barbarians, corruption, and moral decay, but beneath every invasion and riot was the same invisible fire, the destruction of trust in money. Rome could command armies but not faith. It could conquer territory but not value. And here lies the real secret. The fall of Rome was not just a story of swords and emperors. It was the story of inflation, eroding an empire from the inside out. When money failed, loyalty followed. And when loyalty died, Rome was already gone centuries before its walls fell. But what most historians call collapse was only the symptom. The true disease lay deeper, hidden inside the machinery of money itself. Rome's downfall was not accidental. It followed a financial logic as old as power itself. When an empire cannot raise enough through taxes, it turns to a quieter weapon, the mint. Debasement was not just desperation, it was policy, a secret tax on every Roman who held a coin. Each time an emperor reduced the silver content, he created new money without openly taking from his people. The state paid soldiers with freshly minted coins, but the value those coins carried came from everyone else, from the merchants whose prices rose, from the workers whose wages lagged, from the farmers who saw their savings turn to dust. Inflation was not random chaos. It was state alchemy, transferring wealth from the many to the few who touched the money first. This is the mechanism economists now call the Cantillon effect, though Rome practiced it long before the theory had a name. The closer one stood to the mint, the richer one became. Generals, contractors, and officials thrived, while the people paid in silence. By the time the debased coins reached the markets of Gaul or Syria, their worth had already evaporated. To mask the rot, Rome reformed its money again and again. New denominations, new portraits, new promises. But no reform could restore what had been destroyed trust. Once faith in value disappears, no decree can resurrect it. Sound familiar? In modern times, nations no longer shave silver from coins. They print credit from central banks. They manipulate interest rates instead of metal content. But the logic is identical. Short-term survival purchased with long-term decay. Between 2008 and 2020, America's money supply expanded by over 500%. Trillions appeared on digital ledgers with the same quiet confidence as Nero's first melt of silver. The empire of paper has replaced the empire of bronze. But both run on belief, and belief is the most fragile currency of all. Rome's mints once hummed night and day, feeding an illusion of prosperity. Today, our printing presses hum in silence, creating the same mirage in pixels instead of silver. The secret mechanism has not changed, only its disguise. And that mechanism, hidden beneath statistics and policy, leads every empire to the same ending. The question is not whether it repeats, but when. The fall of Rome is not ancient history. It is a mirror. Every empire begins with honest money and ends with debt disguised as wealth. Rome's coins were once silver. Ours are promises printed on paper and screens. Yet both depend on the same fragile faith, that tomorrow, value will still exist. When President Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, America crossed the same invisible line Nero did. The dollar became pure fiat, valuable only because the government said so. Since then, U.S. debt has risen from under $400 billion to over $34 trillion. Like the Roman emperors who paid their legions with debased coins, modern states pay their obligations with newly created dollars. The numbers rise, but the value falls. The pattern is identical. Inflation benefits those closest to the source governments, banks, and corporations, while eroding the savings and wages of ordinary citizens. In Rome, soldiers demanded more coins to survive. In America, workers demand higher pay just to keep up. The cycle of money decay always ends the same way: distrust. And distrust kills empires. When citizens no longer believe their currency holds truth, they no longer believe the system itself does. Rome responded with control, price edicts, forced labor, and confiscation. Today, we respond with regulation, stimulus, and digital surveillance of money, different tools, same fear. History's warning is not abstract. It is carved into the ruins of every fallen civilization. You cannot print trust. Once lost, it cannot be recovered by decree or policy. Rome's empire ended not with a battle, but with a whisper, the soft rustle of worthless coins in an empty market. America still has time to listen to that sound. Because when the money dies, the idea of the empire dies with it. And in that silence, the echoes of Rome remind us, no nation survives the corruption of its own currency. Only the illusion does.